Welcome to Shareholder Primacy from Free Float Media, a podcast about activist investing, securities law, and all the ways the financial and legal worlds intersect and collide in real life. As everyone here knows, I'm usually talking to Ann Lipton, law professor at Tulane, but Ann is going to one more conference. So Ann and I invited Sarah Haan, a law professor at Washington and Lee Law School, to join us. Hey, Sarah, say hello.
Hey, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
So are we. So am I. Ann and Sarah are colleagues who kind of run in the same circles and so forth, of course. I first saw Sarah's kind of scholarship and thinking and writing when I was doing a little bit on rational apathy, which we talked about on the podcast. I don't know, Sarah, if you saw that or saw what I had put together. Yeah. I was really curious about that. And I did a post on it, and then Ann and I talked about that on the podcast. And she had this article that was great. It had a terrific definition, very concise definition of rational apathy. We can talk about that a little bit if we want. And it also had a wonderful reference to Homo economicus, which was just, of course, a phrase and a creature that's dear to my University of Chicago free market heart. So I don't know if you remember that. The Homo economicus reference, Sarah, but I was I was quite appreciative of that.
I love talking about rational apathy or shareholder passivity, right?
Yes,
now
exactly.
is a good moment to talk about that because of it seems to be moving into our politics.
Yes, we will. That's part of the theme I want to kind of get to today. Because Sarah has explored in some of her recent work connections between corporate governance and civic governance, or really the parallels between shareholder democracy, which we talk about a lot, and kind of public democracy. Would that be a good way to talk about the public sphere, public democracy or civic democracy?
Yeah, I talk about political democracy and corporate democracy, right?
Okay, great. So I just want to make sure that we have the distinction right. And she did that most recently in a really interesting article, not a scholarly bit, but a more widely distributed bit in ProMarket, the University of Chicago Business School Journal, about how we can, and her theme, and help me on this, Sarah, was how we can understand what's going on in current national affairs, political democracy, by looking not at developments like overseas, like in Hungary or the Soviet or Russia or someplace, but instead by looking at developments and trends in corporate governance and activism and so forth, rather than looking at civic affairs in other countries. Do I kind of have that theme? Did I express that kind of right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, there are two political scientists, Stephen Levitsky at Harvard and Lucan Way at the University of Toronto, who have come out and they've started writing about what Americans should basically expect in democratic breakdown. So they sort of take for granted that we're headed toward a form of authoritarianism. We are experiencing democratic breakdown. And so they're essentially trying to counsel Americans, here's what's coming. And they look to foreign countries' elected dictators around the globe. Sure. And what they've said is that we have to look forward to a form of what they call competitive authoritarianism. And so they say competitive authoritarianism is when you still have elections, but the elections are so skewed that they're always going to come out one way because the rules have been fixed. Does that sound like anything?
That sounds a little familiar, actually. And so it sounds like you basically took off on that to and spend some time looking at these issues, and then we can talk about how they reflect back on. So not reflect back on corporate governance and corporate affairs. So not only how those what I work on and what you study in securities and so forth inform political democracy, but then what we can learn about that in corporate governance, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it does sound familiar.
I'd like to be, in conversation both with the political scientists and with the corporate governance and securities law specialists, because I think actually both groups can kind of learn from each other as we head into democratic breakdown.
All right, so why don't we talk briefly about sort of the theme and sort of what you covered in the ProMarket article, and then we can sort of discuss some of its implications. Would you help me with that, please?
Well, so I just essentially make the argument that competitive authoritarianism has, a different name in the United States. We call it corporate democracy. It is where you have these sort of entrenched and insiders who take control of the machinery of corporate elections to keep themselves in power sort of in perpetuity. And there are a lot of reasons why someone would want to be in control of a big corporate enterprise. And then I talk about some of the main mechanisms of controlling corporate elections, and talk about how they can be translated into political governance, right? So things like we were just talking about shareholder passivity or rational apathy.
Rational apathy, yeah, okay.
Right, or differences in vote allocations, voting power, right? Or just micromanaging the administration of elections. I think that's a big one that you see a lot of in corporate democracy, and we're seeing more and more of it in political democracy.
Right.
And then at the end, one of the nice things I think that Levitsky and Way do when they write about competitive authoritarianism is they ask, well, what are the sort of sources of democratic resilience that we might be able to fall back on?
How can these institutions recover?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. One of the curious things to me about the American corporation is that it has had a foundational democratic structure for more than 200 years.
Yeah.
When you go into a corporate law classroom, what you're likely to hear from a standard corporate law professor is that democracy is really irrelevant to corporate governance. And yet we've retained this fundamental democratic structure for more than 200 years. So it's kind of interesting to sort of wonder about that and whether democracy is doing anything for the functioning of corporations and whether it also plays maybe a bigger role in our society.
Right. Well, let's explore. There's some of the parallels here. Again, we can kind of dig into a little bit. While there's many features to, and again, I come from the corporate perspective rather than the political perspective. And the main event, and we're coming up on this, is elections, and the elections I'm talking about are board elections, where we're looking for seats on a board of directors, but even some of the language starts to get kind of similar. We're talking about campaigning and counting votes and so forth. And so there's a lot of these kind of parallels. And for a long time, I think, at least on the corporate side where I'm coming from, people sort of ignored or willfully kind of didn't look at some of the parallels here. But I think they're becoming a lot more relevant. As we've thought more about elections, in the U.S., more continuous elections and so forth, and as the parties in corporate elections have become a lot more sophisticated with public relations efforts and how to count votes and how to manage votes and so forth. So we talk mostly about the actual election. And I suppose there's probably some similarities there between the actual elections themselves in a board election for a company, and then also in civic elections. Maybe we could kind of look at some of those a little bit.
Well,
what would those look like?
All the pieces are there. I mean, one. Depending on how granular we want to get, there's just a basic accountability mechanism there that I want to highlight, right? Which is the foundational idea that the leader is accountable to the people who elect them, right? And so that is a very important idea in all forms of democracy. And then, of course, you have all the election mechanics that are implemented to sort of actualize democracy, right? So how often are you having elections? Ironically, corporate elections happen so much more frequently than political elections.
Most of the time. There's plenty of times where companies play around with that schedule. So here, the companies are in control of the schedule of elections, and there's laws that require them to hold them at a certain frequency, but if they don't, you have to go take them to court. In the U.S., elections just happen. I don't think there's any need to compel an election in the U.S. It's rare, right?
Well, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I think it's really similar, honestly. I mean, when you get somebody in a position of power and they don't want to give up power, how do you compel them to hold an election?
Right.
I'm sure there are examples. Yeah.
Right. Are we going to be canceling national elections here in 2028? I don't know. I hope not.
Well, that's right, because Donald Trump faces a sort of hard stop on his presidency, and maybe he will try to reject that.
Try to do that, and he'll be learning from there's certain companies. I'm working on one now where they haven't held a board meeting, an AGM, in 12 or 13 or 14 months, and we're about to haul them into court and say you need to have an election.
Well, another thing that you see in corporate elections sometimes is playing around with particular board candidates where, the incumbent board will nominate somebody to the board so that they become an incumbent, right? And then maybe not run them for re-election, and then after the election, just by board fiat, place them on the board again.
Just appoint them.
Just appoint them. Well, one company that I have seen do this is ExxonMobil. They've played a little bit around with putting people on the board by board fiat. The board just elects them, and putting off these shareholder determinations about whether that candidate should be on the board. So, that's exactly right. There are a lot of ways to play games. One of the things I guess that I try to say in my piece is that
go ahead.
In corporate elections, there is a lot of comfort with this game playing. Or maybe another way to say that is corporate leaders get away with a lot of game playing. And that's why I think we should sort of be aware of that as corporate leaders move into politics, because that comfort level they have with playing around with the rules of the game, they're going to bring that comfort level and that maybe shamelessness, if you will, they're going to import it right into our politics, and things that were unthinkable a few years ago are suddenly going to be happening, and we're going to have to react to it.
And part of your point, I guess, is that they were unthinkable, but they were thinkable in the past 20 or 30 or more years in this whole different realm. And interestingly, some of the same people are now becoming a lot more prominent in political democracy at this point. Between Elon Musk, who's got his experience, his share of experience with corporate governance stuff, and Steve Bannon came from Goldman Sachs, from a corporate background. I mean, a bunch of people
absolutely.
Like that. Yeah, right.
Right. I mean, it's not a coincidence that we're starting to see all of these men just step over right out of corporate leadership into political leadership. They're just seamlessly making that transition, right? Right.
And borrowing some of the same techniques. All right. So there's actually some other interesting parallels here that I want to kind of mention. We've talked a little bit about, rational apathy and how just how corporate leaders, boards kind of rely on apathetic shareholders. Political leaders rely on apathetic voters, or to try to kind of focus the election only on the least apathetic voters that they know they're going to support them. And that there's a parallel there between, in focusing, I suppose, on some of the biggest funds in board elections. I think they're less incented to be kind of apathetic. They have more incentive to want to vote. That's probably where rational apathy probably has its biggest, I think, application here. Does that sound right?
Well, I mean, I've written quite a bit about the pathology of passivity and this idea that corporate leaders for many decades cultivated a sense of passivity.
There you go.
They tried to encourage shareholders to be passive so that, when they voted the proxies, they would be in full control. Then I think they got kind of a nasty surprise when asset managers started awakening, right? And so that has really shifted power dynamics in corporate governance. Wouldn't it be nice, I'm sure they all think, if we could just go back to the days where all shareholders were super passive, and then
just adopted the corporate recommendation and so forth. Or there was the whole broker voting, which has really been limited. That was a way to kind of encourage or kind of get around, encourage apathy. So interesting. Okay, cool. So
right, because brokers could be relied on to vote the way management wanted.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. There's a couple other places where this comes up. And then there's some specific applications that we can probably talk about. There seems to be a parallel between kind of ballot access in political democracy or civic affairs. The whole process for just getting onto a ballot, petitions and so forth. Political scientists have studied this for generations. There seems to be a parallel between that and like advance notice bylaws. And all the different ways that companies kind of try to stop shareholder democracy kind of before it starts. Does that kind of ring true for you as well, or something that you kind of have seen?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, as soon as we started to see some competitiveness come to corporate elections, and the last 20 years or so, when we've started to see sort of more democracy or more democratic features in corporate governance, we started seeing more roadblocks being invented by creative corporate lawyers, right? And so, and I don't blame them, right? That's their job, is to serve their client.
And they were aided in some part by friendly courts, including in Delaware, which has basically allowed all sorts of form. They've limited it lately, but the whole idea of advance notice bylaws, the Delaware Chancery Court basically allows. So,
right, advance notice bylaws are a great example of that, because you can really throw up these roadblocks to participation, and it's really just up to the courts to eventually create some guardrails and say, no, that you've taken it too far. You finally taken it too far, and we won't know how far is too far until we get the cases.
Right.
Or I guess until the Delaware legislature weighs in.
They act finally. And then there seems to be one final parallel between kind of dual class shares and maybe like the U.S. Electoral College. Is that roughly correct, or is there some fundamental difference there?
When I talk about corporate democracy, one of the first reactions I tend to get, especially from corporate law types, is that corporate democracy is so different from political democracy because we have equality in political elections, and we just have completely rejected that in corporate elections because we use one share, one vote in corporate elections. And what's so strange about that, of course, is it's just completely wrong. I mean, we do have this principle, and I think this ideal of one person, one vote in American political elections that didn't really exist as a constitutional law idea until the 1960s, believe it or not.
Right, until the Voting Rights Act finally established that conclusively, yes.
Well, and there's case law, right, where the United States Supreme Court basically imposed this rule or this idea of one person, one vote. But it doesn't extend, for example, to our election of the United States Senate, right? So we don't...
Right, yes, exactly.
And it doesn't extend to the Electoral College, right? So if you are a voter in Wyoming, your vote for president counts more than if you are a lot more than a voter in California. And so this idea that I think a lot of Americans have that, well, it's just we're really wedded to one person, one vote, and this sort of mathematically perfect equality in political governance. We're so virtuous in political governance, and it's so different from corporate governance is, I think, wrong. And what I say in this piece on ProMarket is that, in corporate governance, we're actually pretty comfortable with different vote allocations and with the idea of inequality in voting. And that's another area where I expect to see, when you move corporate leaders into our political governance, they're going to bring these ideas with them, and they're going to also try to exploit differences in vote allocations. And I think we're seeing Elon Musk already doing this.
Wow. All right. So maybe some form of dual class shares in civic elections is going to start to it already has, but maybe even more stark.
Yeah, I would say it already sort of exists. Gerrymandering is another example, of ways that we sort of play around with, who gets to vote for what representative. And Anyway, so in politics, there's a lot of playing around, and in corporate governance, there's a lot of playing around. It turns out, and I just think that the two are kind of converging.
Wow. All right. Hey, I want to cover some of the more specific applications, as I hinted at when we introduced all this in corporate governance and activism and so forth. And then talk about a few other things about you and your research and so forth. But let's do that after we take a little break.
Shareholder Primacy is brought to you by FreeFlowAnalytics.com, the only free database of corporate directors, their influence, and their performance. If you own a stock or retirement plan, go to FreeFlowAnalytics.com and look up which of your elected directors are performing well and which aren't. Use your vote in the alternative democracy and get your data at FreeFlowAnalytics.com. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Shareholder Primacy. I'm Mike Levin, sitting here with Sarah Haan of Washington and Lee School of Law. We were talking for a little bit about the parallels between civic and corporate elections, or political and shareholder democracy. I wanted to return to that and reflect it back onto some very specific issues in activism and securities law and really in companies, and sort of figure out what we can learn there from what we're starting to see in civic or political democracy. So one thing that activists have been talking about, endlessly, is the impact of the universal proxy card on elections. And there's already been some interesting impacts about how elections are, board elections are running and so forth. One thing that has started to become an interesting feature is board elections are getting to be a lot more personal. We're not necessarily talking about how an activist's thesis compares to a company's plan, but we're starting to really go candidate by candidate in board elections, and smart activists are starting to make those comparisons very easy, and to really point out the advantages of some of their challengers on a slate compared to some of the incumbent board directors. This has got to sound familiar to anybody who is trying to make these comparisons to civic elections. Does that seem that way to you?
Oh, 100%. I mean, this is the consequence of moving from the sort of original proxy to the universal proxy, where voters can now mix and match, right? So
right.
Before the universal proxy, you were basically voting for a whole group. Actually, you just kind of had a binary choice, approve of what management was doing or don't. Right. And now you can granularly sort of look at the candidates and compare the qualities of the candidates, and
one by one, exactly.
Right, and choose. If there's one new person that you think should be on the board, you have to choose somebody you're not going to vote for, and so then right. You're called on to sort of pick the weak one. And so I think we see in the electoral cycle, we see activists, trying to pick off the weak directors, and that is a wake up call for directors.
But there are lessons to be had from civic elections where that happens routinely, right? I mean, that happens all the time where you're trying
one
to
thing, I mean, I guess the go-to thing that makes me think of course, is the extraordinary expense of regular political elections. I mean, one of the reasons that we spend so much money on our elections is because you have all of these campaign ads and videos and media, because you really have to present each candidate. Each candidate's trying to present themselves in the most favorable light, and doing that, using modern media. And of course, anybody who watched that big Disney proxy fight last year.
There was every potential source of media and promotional stuff. My understanding is that it may have not been that one, but may have been another proxy contest where at least one or both the parties had hired Washington political consultants.
Oh, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. My understanding is that proxy contest cost about $70 million,
yes,
which is about as much as your median run-of-the-mill gubernatorial election.
Yeah, exactly. So right. I think there's another interesting application to how either within the context of a board election or possibly outside, how shareholders or how activists and company leadership communicates with shareholders. And let me kind of set the stage for this comparison a little bit. I frequently will talk to an activist who says, "I'm really upset with the company. The share price is really in the depths. I want to write a letter. I'm going to send a news release, and I'm going to communicate with the CEO. And I'm going to tell them what I think. And I'm telling them they're wasting their time. They need to be communicating with the shareholders. That one shareholder needs to be talking to all the other shareholders and saying, "This is I'm trying to persuade you that I'm right." And similarly, a smart CEO or smart board is going to use, and they have some natural advantages here in community, kind of like the incumbency advantage in civic elections, in terms of communicating with their shareholders. So it's much less important that the activists be talking to the board, and much more important that they, similarly with the board, that they be talking to shareholders. That probably rings true in terms of the whole context of civic elections and political democracy. Would it?
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting insight, and certainly in political democracy, citizens engage in collective action, right, by sort of associating together and communicating and sort of building campaigns. And we're just basically seeing a lot of this same behavior now in corporate governance with the proviso, I guess, that, it's possible for regulation to put some limits on shareholder communication, or there are, behind the scenes kind of communication can be limited. That might be something that we're expecting to see. We might see more of that under a Trump SEC.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But I mean, and anything sort of public that's out in the public domain is also going to discipline management, and they'll be forced to respond to it. Yeah.
Right.
Just like in politics.
Let's migrate a little bit to talking about some of the regulatory and legal environment in which all this kind of takes place. Elections, corporate elections in the U.S. are regulated sort of in two ways. There's state level, the biggest state, of course, is Delaware. And then also there's some federal regulation of corporate elections, mostly relating to the communication around the election. I think that's roughly the way to think about how corporate elections are regulated. Does that seem to be correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it is so strange the way that it all developed over many decades. But because we use delegated voting in corporate elections, in other words, shareholders' votes tend to be exercised by someone else, which we don't use.
It's by proxy, exactly. You appoint a proxy, right? You can't do that in civic elections. There's one big difference.
You can't do it yet in political elections.
Yeah, good.
But it's extremely powerful for corporate incumbents to be able to exercise somebody else's vote and cast that vote for themselves. That's an enormous power. So I would, if Donald Trump can figure out a way to exercise that power in political elections, I'm sure he'll do it.
Oh wow, that would be a big development. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, it would be a huge sea change in the way we think about our political elections, but one of, I think, many. So we created this sort of proxy system many years ago, and then this led to the practice of proxy solicitation, and then around the time of the Great Depression, there was all of this concern that the proxy system had been basically become subject to abuse. So during the New Deal...
Sounds familiar.
Well, right. I mean, I think there's a real question as to whether we're just going to sort of recreate the Great Depression and the New Deal in the next few years.
Okay.
We'll just reinvent the wheel, I guess.
Right,
but
right.
We got the 1934 Act, which allowed, the act which created the SEC also authorized the SEC to regulate the proxy system. So they weren't authorized to make foundational corporate law, but there's a lot of overlap between regulating the proxy system, because the proxy system is corporate elections, so they can regulate some aspects of corporate elections, and they invented the proxy statement. The SEC just invented that out of whole cloth.
Right.
And then started saying, here are the things you need to put in the proxy statement.
Right. Here's the kind of information requirements. Yeah.
But, states were not doing that. There was no equivalent of the proxy statement developed under state corporate law before the late 1930s. So anyway, as a result, we ended up with this sort of mess where some aspects of corporate governance and corporate elections are regulated by the state and others are regulated by the feds. And,
really, and specifically the SEC there. And sometimes they delegate a little bit of that, like to the exchanges or something like that, but it's largely the SEC.
Well, the Department of Labor, regulates some aspects too that bear on the voting. Anyway, it's become very complicated, which is good for lawyers because that's how we add value, right?
Right. But it seems to be that would be something of a difference then between civic and corporate democracy and elections, which is that civic is almost entirely regulated at the local level.
That's true.
And we have this kind of layer of kind of corporate of national regulation of elections and so forth at the federal level through the SEC, which could be changing. Depending on sort of what happens the next few years, I suppose, at the SEC. I don't see much change. I mean, there's some changes cooking in Delaware, which we can mention. I'm sure.
Well, I do think, right.
Opinions about that.
As you start to see Delaware lose some of its clout, if that is what's going to happen, and there's going to be more competition among the states, and it becomes, as academics like to say, and like to really worry about, a sort of race to the bottom. If that is the way corporate law is headed, there'll become more pressure to federalize corporate law. I mean, all of it. So,
and that's been talked about on and off.
Yes, for many, more than 100 years, yeah.
Right, and so that would be an interesting departure from this parallel, where there seems to be this, even more gravitation in civic affairs to regulating elections at the local level. Conceivably, it could go, again, a lot of the techniques and so forth, the parallels will be this, aren't going to change. But, regulation of at least corporate democracy, gravitating more to the federal level could be an interesting development. Wow.
Well, it'll subject everything to greater polarization because, in other words, I think we'd be kind of whipsawed because with every time the administration changes, I mean, we're sort of experiencing this now. Every time the administration changes, all the rules of the game are rewritten.
Oh, sure.
And that is problematic. I mean, our current system where, we have 50 states and they each have their own sort of corporate governance regime. And I mean, to some extent, that is insulating the system, the wider sort of corporate economy from what seems to be the polarization, the rising polarization.
Right. And kind of the shifting winds of political affairs, right? Setting aside what's going on in Delaware and how many corporations are going to lose to Nevada or Texas and so forth, the regulation of corporate law, including elections, but other things, is fairly consistent, year to year, even decade to decade. I mean, there's trends, but it changes kind of slowly. That's one of the advantages, I suppose, of a place like Delaware or some other good states.
It changes slowly precisely because, right, it's so dispersed. And that's why I think it's kind of alarming to start to see states, announcing that they're going to radically change their law and it's going to be now an outlier.
That's got to be a real shock to someone who's followed this.
It is such an exciting time to be a corporate law professor. It's like being a professor of constitutional law.
Right. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of your professorship and some of your other work. I do know you teach. I think you said you teach a class on proxy contests. Is that right?
I taught sort of a 1-credit intensive on proxy contests at UVA last semester. Yeah, I mean, proxy contests are becoming a really hot topic. In part, you've been circulating data yourself about how the universal proxy may be causing more proxy contests. And that's, headline news. That's a really big deal. And of course, for lawyers or budding lawyers, the proxy contest kind of represents an industrial complex. Right.
There's a lot
Yeah.
You're able to stay very busy. So what was some of the curriculum in the class?
Oh, I mean, we talked about, we started because it's a law class,
Right.
some of the intellectual underpinnings, right? Why do we have elections in corporate law at all? What are they doing?
Right.
And then, who pays for it? One of the big legal questions related to proxy contests is who should pay for corporate elections if we think they're a valuable thing to have?
I have an answer.
Oh, I'd love to hear your answer.
Not me. I think companies should pay for the whole thing and should reimburse me when I have to spend money on it. But that's a minority view.
Well, I mean, on some level, it makes a lot of sense. If the corporation is getting value out of testing its leadership through regular elections, if that's
Right.
bringing value to the enterprise, and I think people believe that it does, that's why we do them, then
Right.
it would make sense for the corporation to pay for them. But there are all kinds of interesting theories out there about, how you incentivize just exactly the right amount of activism.
Right.
These sort of
That's been a longstanding complaint about activists is that when we run a proxy contest, we're spending our money. And when a company is involved in a proxy contest, they're also spending our money. So
Yeah, but I mean, in fairness, though, if you were to open it up completely, I think you'd get a lot of crackpots. I mean, I think also
yeah.
the history of American corporate governance shows that just like in political governance, there are a lot of crackpots out there just sort of waiting for their opportunity.
Right. Exactly. And that's some of, when you think about like public funding of elections, which is, there's another parallel here between, what kind of funding of corporate elections, what should funding of corporate elections look like? So, yeah.
Yeah. And then we looked at, in the class, we looked at all of the sort of mechanics of, proxy contests are really complicated. Even just sort of figuring out who's casting whose vote is really interesting and complicated. We looked at some high profile proxy contests. One that really interested me was the proxy contest that kind of petered out at or was settled at Starbucks because that was a labor union
with the SEIU, right? Exactly.
Yeah, labor union led proxy contest, and there's commentary suggesting that the union maybe never really wanted to actually bring the election to a vote. That really they were always sort of looking just to move leadership on the issues they care about, and
on their very specific labor organizing issues, right?
Right, and that they were successful at doing that, and so then
somewhat. I mean, there's another perspective that in fact they were starting to fail, and so they kind of gave up and claimed whatever victory they could because there were plenty of others. Again, this is where you have to appeal to all the electorate, the shareholders, and sort of see and the problem is there you can't. You can sort of give up in the middle of claim victory. If you're in a civic election, it's kind of hard once you're nominated. You got to take it through to the end, and if you lose badly, you just accept it. So.
Yes. Well, Michael, let me ask you,
Sure.
What proxy contests do you see as being the headline proxy contests in 2025? Can we tell yet?
Well, a biggie that we just saw concluded, and again, the lens I look at is how universal proxy. That's kind of been my hobby. A real interesting one was Air Products and Mantle Ridge. That just concluded. Mantle Ridge originally, and it illustrates some of the truths about universal proxy so well. That Mantle Ridge originally nominated 7 or 8 people. I think it's for a 9 or 10 person board. We're looking for a big majority. Probably quickly figured out the extent of support that they could expect, and in a timely way scaled it back to 4 candidates. And Air Products was a sick company. They needed some help. They had a significant unhappy shareholder base. They took it to an election. They did not settle this, which is a big trend. Because after universal proxy, a lot of contests getting settled, and settled on much more favorable terms to activists than in the past. And the I don't know if you know the principal of Mantle Ridge is a guy by the name of Paul Halal, who worked a lot with Bill Ackman at Pershing Square. Real experienced, serious activist, really knows what he's doing. And after the election, they won. Himself and 2 other people won 3 out of 4 of the seats they were looking for, and they were basically calibrated very specifically the extent of support they could expect from shareholders, and nominated almost exactly the number of seats needed to express that support. And it was, in some ways, it was a very straightforward kind of proxy contest. There wasn't a whole lot of, negativity. It was a little bit, but it was, there wasn't any kind of shenanigans. It just was a very specific expression of what I think universal proxy was designed to achieve. So that was the one that most impressed me so far this year. There's a whole long list that are kind of cooking right now. That again, they reflect a lot of the same stuff we've been talking about. Some of the truths about how they're getting more personal, about how the communication's becoming a lot more important, and a lot of the stuff that that you've been studying and making these comparisons to are starting to find their way here.
Well, one thing that interests me.
Go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that interests me, connecting with something that you were just talking about, is whether certain activists are going to develop a real reputation for being just, super smart and essentially leaders that should be followed by other investors, so that they basically, I'm going to analogize them now to sort of political parties, but this idea that you might have sort of a group of people who are watching a de facto leader, right? An activist who's sort of like a leader, who, when they go after a company, everybody kind of gets in line behind them and says, if Bill says that this company needs
this
a change,
guy's really good at communicating and so forth, and that's a really interesting parallel, because you're right. There's going to be in civic affairs, there's certain kind of leaders that just develop a following, and that's definitely possible here. And what's so interesting about that is most activists, at their core, are like portfolio managers and financial analysts. They don't think hard about how to communicate. Okay, if you look at some of the presentation documents that they come up with, these 50, 80, 100 or more page PowerPoint documents, getting into minute detail about their case, that's hard. That's hard for an electorate to kind of consume. And there's going to be others that kind of combine a flair for communicating with, thorough analysis of the issues of policy, okay, and some amount of power politics here. There's some of that happens, okay, where if you're someone like Elliott, Elliott is feared because, they're willing to use all the potential tools, and they're willing to spend money on this kind of stuff. That is definitely, a possibility here of almost a likelihood.
Yeah, I agree.
There will be some sort of small set of very shrewd activists that are willing to go beyond their financial analytical chops to spend the kind of money and learn how to communicate with other shareholders in a very slick way. Wow.
And then the question is, does that then become a sort of proving ground to then transition over into politics, right? I mean, it's all very similar, right? If you can really raise your profile through shareholder activism, and suddenly, proxy contests matter more, they're in the press, and you've got these swashbuckling activists, and suddenly they're becoming more like household names, why not just make that leap why not create your own government agency?
Bill Ackman has talked about that, or has been talked that Bill Ackman, who is a very prominent and very successful activist, he hasn't done activism in a while. At least he hasn't done corporate, shareholder activism. He's done other kind of activism at Harvard and some other places. Yes. He's been talked about as someone, hey, maybe he's got a career in politics anyway. There is so much more that we could talk about. This is just so fun. I'd love to hear more about some of your other research. We talked about that a little bit, and so forth. But we'll probably have to have another discussion maybe in a little while after proxy season to sort of see if some of our theories have worked out about what's going to happen.
I would love that.
So let's do that some more. What do you say?
Terrific.
All right, cool. Let's wrap up, and let's give people here a little break to think about everything we've talked about, okay? So thanks, Sarah. It's been terrific talking to you about all this. This is Shareholder Primacy, normally hosted by Ann Lipton and me, Mike Levin. I'm an independent activist investor and advisor to investors about their activist situations, but instead of Ann, we've been talking to Sarah Haan. She holds an endowed chair at Washington and Lee School of Law. You can find me, Mike, at theactivistinvestor.com, and you can find Sarah at law.wlu.edu. Our podcast is produced and distributed by Free Float Media. Thanks for listening, and we will talk again soon.